Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Salesforce Under the Hood. Today, I'm here with Ross Belmont, who is a director of product management for our platform team. We are going to focus in on named credentials. And why don't we start with, for maybe someone coming new to Salesforce, what exactly are named credentials?
Sure, great question. So when we use the term named credentials, what we're referring to is not only the capability to call out over HTTP to some other external system, but that's coupled with the authentication needed for that call out to actually work. Most times when developers are building something that's an HTTP integration, the auth is where the actual sticky points end up being, right? So we define and work those together. This allows developers to avoid having that sort of OAuth handshake code and pieces like that in their own Apex. We handle the protocol implementation. You set up a credential declaratively, and then either you can use it in code without worrying about those pieces being in your Apex, or your citizen builders can use them in tools like Flow and sidestep all worry of protocols, etc.
Yeah. So when I was newer to the platform and learning about all of this, I always thought about, okay, if you're working with integrations, going outbound from Salesforce, that's when named credentials come into the picture. So I know that named credentials are not new. They've been around for quite a while, but in talking with you, I know that there are some new capabilities. There's a new version of named credentials. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So we moved named credentials to a new architecture on our side to make way for a lot of future growth. That's enabled us to get some interesting features we'll touch on today, sets us up for a bigger future as well. And although that brings into the mix some new ideas for folks to absorb to be as successful as they can with those.
Okay, let's dig right into some of those new ideas. What are they?
Okay, so the first one to take in is that you define the endpoint and the authentication separately now in two separate entities, although they're linked together in the same way that an account and a contact are linked together.
And before, for folks familiar, all of that was on that name credential page when you created a new named credential, right?
Yes, it was all just sort of in one big soup together, right? And now some of the things that we'll touch on today, you'll see where we need to add more grain and go to levels of depth that we didn't have when you just had one entity in one simple form.
Got it.
Right?
Okay. So that first idea is the decoupling of the endpoint and the credential. And then what about the second new idea?
Yes. So now we also have explicit permissioning. We've done a lot around security and multiple sort of vectors for both end users and ISVs. Creating a credential no longer gives access to that credential to anyone by default. So going to a secure by default posture, which of course we have all over across the Salesforce platform, now bringing that into the credentialing space.
Anything else in that security space that we should know about this new named credentials?
Individual end users will need permission to use a credential in the space of a call out, right? In the context of a call out, so to speak. And that can be granted in multiple ways. We like to recommend that you tie a credential to a permission set and then think about distributing that using permission set groups, et cetera, as you would follow the best practices in those spaces, right? There's also the element for ISVs where ISVs need to be allow listed to use a credential that an administrator had created by hand, so to speak, and they did not package. So if the ISV brings the credential in because they're aware of what the configuration should be against a remote system, then the package can use the credential. But if that's not the case, and the administrator takes explicit action to make a credential themselves, and we identify some custom backend system or something like that for a third party package to use that, it would have to be allow listed.
Oh, got it. Is it all under this umbrella of named credentials, or is this being rebranded in any way? What should folks be looking for?
Sure. So we still do have the sort of umbrella of named credentials. What we're not going to be changing is the way in which flow builders or people that write Apex code approach the idea of a named credential. For all those folks, or for that perspective, that's all still the same, right? We don't want to change how the millions of lines of Apex code that are out there referencing name credentials would have to work, right?
Hmm.
That all stays the same. We just move some of these pieces around, like I mentioned, where the authentication moves to what we now call an external credential.
Okay.
That's linked to the name credential, which now mostly is a placeholder for the endpoint itself, right? And versus holding everything, all aspects of the endpoint plus auth.
Got it. And so when people are ready to start using these new external credentials, what do they have to do? Do they have to make a choice between one or the other? Is there any licensing implication? What do they need to know?
Sure, yeah, good to know. So some people are under the impression that they need to sort of switch from name credentials to external credentials. That's not directly the case. You still, like I said, use both together, right? For those that, like I said, use Flow, use Apex, they'll experience it the same way. You just need to create a new type of credential. It's a little bit like record types. There actually is a type designation on the name credential, which will distinguish between what we call legacy and the new model that we call secure endpoint. Anything that's a secure endpoint will need to then reference that external credential to get its auth. And then there are now pieces underneath the external credential where you can allow for further configuration and
Hmm.
levels of grain that some of our enterprise customers have wanted. So it's more about keeping your focus on knowing, okay, that the auth piece is moving to the external credential. How do I
Hmm.
understand that and get the most out of that?
Got it. And when can people expect to see this start appearing in their org?
A lot of these pieces are GA. We've
Awesome.
got some new capabilities around long-standing requests like client credentials as a part of the OAuth spec, right? More extensibility for JOTs. Those are sometimes both used in server-to-server use cases, which are really
Hmm.
popular. So those capabilities are out now. What we're working on to sort of wrap all this up is the notion of using 2G packaging
Hmm.
around these.
Okay.
Although I'll mention that you might want to keep an eye on how you plan to distribute these because those that are paying really close attention may know that when you have something like a password inside a credential or any sort of shared secret that's
Hmm.
going to reference that external system, those actually have never been packageable or distributable because that would
Right.
that would imply that they could be read out in clear text XML with a metadata retrieve. And
Right.
that's never been possible.
And they're not metadata, really. We don't think of those individual credentials as metadata themselves, or we haven't.
Right. It's the setup piece of it, so to speak, you could sort of think of, right? But we're actually storing those as data in a different record that's called the user credential. And so since data itself isn't packageable, you sidestep that problem. But if you did want to have a sort of a CI/CD stance or infrastructure as code, policy as code type of
Hmm.
setup for this capability, you can use a new Connect API that we offer that's a control plane around name credentials. So you can
Okay.
use packaging and push that as far as it can, although knowing that it won't hold the secrets.
Yep.
Um, that'll get you a good percentage away. If you'd like to automate everything and fill in what's missing, we've got the Connect API for you. That Connect API also has some level of access for ISVs working in Apex.
Got it. And that new Connect API, just to make sure everyone's clear on it, it is for packaging, but it's not just available for ISVs, right? It's available for anyone using a 2GP package. So even for individual customers themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. So we see cases with customers or large customers or SIs that are looking to have sort of as light a touch as possible with
Mhm.
human intervention in production. And can they script everything? Right. And we want to
Right.
give an answer for that to those customers who have maybe strict requirements. Maybe they're in a public sector or government spaces, right? And they're limited in what they can do and, strict testing and scripting around all that is required.
Got it. Awesome. And then just to double click on what's available today, as far as like in the UI and setup, when someone goes to where they're used to seeing named credentials, are they seeing those new features like external credentials in the UI today? Is that available today?
Yes, yeah, you still navigate to the name credentials area of
Hmm.
setup. You'll now see another sub tab for
Got it.
external credentials, right? That's where you put in that auth configuration. And then when you drill into one of those records, you'll also notice that there's a new focus on an entity or sort of a child entity that we have called a principal. And
Okay.
the principal is worth thinking about because that sort of is what holds the identity, so to speak, of Salesforce as the calling app. So
Okay.
that can be a human user, but in a lot of cases, we see that it's an integration user, right,
Mm,
or service account type of thing against the remote system. So when your application is sort of created or registered against that remote system, is usually the moment when its credentials are created. Maybe it's a
right.
client ID and secret sort of thing, and the client ID and secret gets stored in this principal object. The
Interesting. Okay.
principal is what gets the permissions. So your end users in Salesforce are getting permission to sort of use that principal in the
Mhm.
moment when they need to make a call out. And you can even have multiple principals to have things like the sales department has one level of access to remote system. Service agents might have a different level of access for managers and, line employees, however we'd like to slice it. The ability to have multiple principals is useful in a lot of
Oh,
scenarios.
definitely. So we can now have multiple principals per external connection per old named credential.
That's right.
That's
Yeah.
great. Okay.
And that's important. A lot of our more demanding customers, in terms of looking at their InfoSec policies, would not want to replicate the credentialing configuration at all, right? To
Right.
make it harder to manage, make it harder to rotate those secrets, things like
Hmm.
that, right? That's not something they want to see.
Got
So
it.
we give them the ability to define these things once, reuse them maximally, right? Even though that creates some new ideas here to understand and absorb.
Yeah, that's exciting. That's really exciting. That's great. So we've talked a lot about what you can expect to see in your org, sort of the theory behind why we're making these changes, but maybe now we can run through an example of how an architect would start to leverage these new tools and hit on maybe anything we haven't talked about just yet.
One nice example is in the world of AWS. So let's take that example. We've spent a lot of the past 2 years expanding our global partnership with AWS and taking advantage of the utmost that they have to offer on their stack in terms of how client applications, in this case like Salesforce, would call in and execute jobs or
Hmm.
access resources on AWS, right? So not only do we have support for their protocol, we have it configured in a way where certificates can be used to assert that principle I mentioned a second ago,
Hmm.
right? So you may be in a situation where you'd rather not have something like a password in Salesforce at
Right.
all, right? To worry about having to rotate, or does someone, mishandle it in some way, something like that, right? Instead, wrap your certificate infrastructure around that problem. This new feature that Amazon has called Roles Anywhere
Mm.
as a part of their identity and access management tools,
Hmm.
and allows client apps to present a certificate. And then when they do that, it makes unique use of their permissioning infrastructure. It's analogous to our profiles and permission sets,
I see. Okay.
but it's called IAM in their space. But
Hmm.
it allows the administrators the way to sort of administer out those permissions in a way that's most native to that stack. And then it's closest to those resources. So you can have explicit access to a certain S3 bucket or a certain database table, things like that, right?
Hmm.
This can put you into the space of getting close to what we offer on our platform in terms of detailed record sharing, right? So
Okay.
you think about everything we offer in terms of access control and record sharing. Um, there are partners like AWS that have sophisticated mechanisms that are analogous to that. But then the question becomes, how do you take advantage of that from the Salesforce point
Mm.
of view, right?
Right.
What is the best way to do that? How can we best, enforce the security that our customers want to see? Well, when it comes to outbound call out, it's about having granular control, those principles, submitting the information to the server in just the right way, right? So that we make that context clear, and
Hmm.
then the server side can sort of enforce the right context and not return back any data that calling user doesn't deserve to see, so to speak, right?
Right. Right.
So that opens up a lot of interesting sort of avenues there for those
Hmm.
integrations, especially with the major hyperscale cloud vendors.
Definitely. And how exactly does this new name credential capability support that in a way that our old classic or legacy, I guess, name credentials? So
Yeah.
how can
Well,
people understand how, the difference essentially?
sure, sure. Well, in those situations, we'd only have a very simplistic use of certificates, right? Some of these are unique or proprietary protocols. You may not have the idea of, like we said, multiple principals,
Yep.
right? To be able to distinguish. And to extend on that prior story, you would take the same example, but you might have a different certificate for the sales team versus the marketing team
Ah, I
versus the
see.
service team, right? To identify them uniquely when it comes to calling that server side, right? And you just wouldn't have had that option before. Either do your best to write that in Apex, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
have multiple credentials with duplicative information, right? And it would be less obvious how you sort of attribute that authentication to the workload that's happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that would have been sort of clumsy,
Yeah.
and we clean that up and give you sort of a first class way to handle all that.
Some folks might be wondering, we touched on this a little bit, but can you articulate again the differences or the advantages in using this new named credential capability instead of just leveraging metadata API to manage our named credentials, our legacy named
Right.
credentials?
Yes, indeed. So this is something that might be a little bit counterintuitive because I'm sure most folks out there are used to using our DX tools or other maybe third-party tools, right, to move your metadata between orgs. So your DevOps Center, a lot of solutions that now exist to help move configurations from dev to test production or to wrap CI/CD around all that and things like that, right? Well, when they point back to the metadata API, that is a critical piece of infrastructure for us and a great capability. Um, However, that'll only get you so far when it comes to the credentialing specifically, right? Again, so those credentials that include secrets, if there's anything like a password to the remote system, that's never going to be exposed in the clear text XML that you'd get when you do a metadata retrieve from your
Right.
org. And, or looking at it a different way, you wouldn't want to store that secret directly in your code in GitHub
Right.
either,
Of course.
right?
Yep.
That would be a great way to fail your SOC 2 audits,
Yeah.
which you don't want to do. So how do you answer for that, right? How do you enable and deliver a CI/CD type experience, which some people consider, like some people use the term infrastructure as code or even policy as code, is a way that we're hearing people talk about this nowadays.
Yep.
Well, we now have this Connect API control plane to allow you to configure credentials from top to bottom using a REST API. So you could use that and set the metadata API side
Mm. Hmm.
for this use case. If you'd like to continue on with using the metadata API as much as possible because your tooling's wrapped around that and that's what you're used to, that's fine as well. That works to a degree. And then if you wanted to completely automate it, you just have to sort of fill in those secrets with this REST API. If you wanted a truly zero touch,
Got it.
zero touching of production type of deployment model, right? So that's available to you. Now,
Excellent.
that may not even strictly be needed in all cases. You might have a situation where you're deploying the code and the majority of the config, and that's enough. And
Hmm.
something in production gets tweaked
Yep.
by hand to enable a capability. And that's another great way to go. But
Right.
we need to give customers those options when they feel restricted from being able to manually make changes in a
Yeah.
production org.
I think that's great. Yeah. Like again, just parity with other, right, best in class applications. I think in the past we just said, well, there's always going to be post deployment manual steps. And now we're giving people more options. I think that's excellent. So Ross, I know that we've covered a whole lot, but are there any other features that you want our architects to be aware of, or any closing guidance you have from them as they start to leverage these new capabilities?
Well, I just want to touch on a couple things that I know customers have asked about quite a bit, right? There's the client credentials variant of OAuth was a common request that we've now delivered on. So I just
Mhm.
want to make everybody aware that that's available.
Yes, and we have a video that I'll link maybe up here about it too, where we did an interview about all of that as well. So good call out.
Yes, exactly. And so, yeah, you may have noticed, the audience may have noticed that we have symmetrical capabilities now around client credentials relative to inbound and outbound auth, right? How you can auth into Salesforce using client credentials, and now the same way, right? Because it is a standard, right? It is a piece of the
Mhm.
auth standard that a lot of customers center around. And we also have the jot bearer flow and custom claims in jots, which are sometimes used in a similar way, right? So you'd have a jot assertion to sort of put the identity out there of that caller,
Mhm.
but in certain cases with certain other external systems, that jot might contain things like user context or some other unique indicators to try to add user context to the call out and go back to those sort of record sharing-esque use cases we talked about before. How does the remote system operate within the context of a specific user, group, department, et cetera, on our side? Allowing custom claims and jots gets us to that when you're using jots and certificates, which a lot of IT departments prefer because then you have certs
Yes.
in the mix and not just passwords. So those are two great capabilities I know customers have wanted to see for a while: custom claims and those client credentials, and we're happy to deliver on those. And then the final thing would just be, like I briefly mentioned ISVs earlier, right?
Yes.
So for the ISVs out there, be aware that when you are asking your subscribers to create the credentials, if that's how you've chosen to deploy, those those credentials would need to be allow listed for your package. Like on a managed package namespace level, the administrator effectively allow lists the fact that a managed package XYZ can use that credential in a call out, right? So that's an important piece, as well as if you can't or don't know the credential config at design time and can't
Mhm.
package it,
Right.
take a look at our Connect API to solve that as well, because we do have Apex exposure for that capability. So you can, to a certain extent, create your credentials in Apex from your
Oh,
managed
interesting.
package. And that's intended to be used for advanced packages that have custom setup experiences,
Got
where
it.
they actually help the admin walk through the setup process.
Mhm.
And the Apex behind those Lightning pages, etc., can create credentials then if need be,
Oh, interesting.
although the administrator will have to manually toggle to enable them. So
Got it.
for security reasons, that some manual step was always required, going back
Mhm.
all the way, rolling back the clock
Yep.
all the way, back to remote site settings and all the way back.
Yep. Yep.
So it's not different in that regard, but it's lesser in terms of that burden, in that all the admins would have to do is flip a toggle switch.
Got it. Well, so many exciting new enhancements. I love that we were able to break down sort of what's now available in your org that you might not have had a chance to really dig into quite yet. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, Ross, for covering the security. We have, new enhancements to the resiliency of our applications when we're calling out to external systems. This was absolutely great. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope to see everyone back here very soon.